So last week I did something midweek and I talked about a word that has a different meaning today than it had back in Roman times. And I still probably wasn't clear enough. Decimate is not a biblical word. I just use it as an easy example that everyone would recognize to say if you were reading something from back in that other time, you'd get a totally different idea of what happened. You might hear about a company of soldiers being decimated and then continuing to fight and think, well, how does that make sense? And this is one of the things that concerns me about studying the Bible is that people are often left thinking, well, that just doesn't make sense to me. I'm not sure I can believe it. I'm not sure I can trust in it. So there's another word I want to talk about. Back in the earlier part of this study, we see that Saul was anointed and then he becomes king and then he messes up. And the prophet Samuel comes to him and says, God told me to anoint someone else. He told me he had raised up someone who's better than you to take your place. And when you read an English translation of the Bible, it's king. We assume David was anointed king. Saul is already anointed king. We got two kings running around. It doesn't make sense. And we see that God has appointed someone, and yet Saul gets to keep being king. That doesn't make sense. And I found something I had never noticed this last week or two. And it helps. It helps your understanding. Maybe it'll set your mind at ease. Originally, Saul is anointed, and there's a word for king, it's Melech. But Saul is anointed, and it says Nagid, La Nagid, the Nagid. And Nagid is a word that means, depending on context, either commander or prince. So when Saul is anointed, he's anointed commander. You could say prince, that's maybe so. But later on, Samuel comes in front of the people and goes through that whole long thing of saying, have I ever wronged any of you? Have I ever taken a bribe? And they say no. And he says, then you should trust me. He says, you've done wrong. You've demanded a king. They had Saul. He wasn't king. Just because he'd been anointed, he wasn't king. He was Nagid. And so then Samuel says, so I'm going to give you a king. God's going to give you a king, but you've done wrong. And they're very upset. They're very nervous. And he tells them, don't be afraid, but you need to follow God. You need to obey God, or you and the king will get swept away. So Saul starts out as Nagid. And then later we have that incident where Saul messes up. And Samuel comes to him and says, God has appointed, he's told me to tell you, he's appointed someone else. And we make the assumption that because David has been anointed, that he's now technically king. Saul's king, David's king, this goes on for a long time. But I noticed that what Samuel tells him is that God has appointed someone as La Nagid. You can take it as commander, you can take it as prince. Strangely, both are kind of applicable when we watch what happens with David over the next decade plus. And so we don't get the message that it seems confusing. Well, if Saul gets deposed, how come he gets to keep being king? It's because he didn't get deposed. No one ever said he did. And so we get confused because in the English version of this, all we ever get is king, king, king. David is Nagid. He certainly became a great commander. He also, you can look at him and say, well, that's a prince. A prince is a king in waiting. So as we said, I was correct. We were correct. Saul's line won't continue. David will become king, but it specifically says he's not king right now. So maybe that helps. Maybe that'll clear something up for you. These last few chapters, especially this last week, challenge a lot of people. There's a lot of killing. David kills two people, and we look at it and we're horrified. And what usually happens is people look at that and they go, how can he be a man after God's own heart? And more importantly, how can he get by with this? Why does God let David get by with this? And once again, it tends to lead people. I read commentaries, I read comments online, and people say you believe in a God who would have to be almost insane. He certainly is not fair, because some people get in trouble and other people get by with it. I'm going to skip ahead. This is a spoiler alert. But you should understand David doesn't get by with it. Nobody gets by with it. That's not the point. What we see is that I think David clings to the law. And the law is there because we're imperfect, because we're broken. And it's to make sure that people who accidentally, unintentionally kill someone don't get caught up in that snare that is the law. And there are always people trying to draw these gray areas. Well, what about this? What about this? I'm not at all saying that self-defense is bad. There are times where wars are thrust upon us, and it's not about judgment. I'm not trying to indicate that at all. We're trying to understand how someone like David can do the things that he did. And the answer is David's still flawed. Under the law, he has the right to do these things. Certainly under kingly law. Kings can do an awful lot. But later on, we're going to see consequences. One of the biggest ones, though, one of the ones that I want to get across today is that later on down the line, David has established this kingdom. He has brought together the north and the south, and they've beaten back enemies, and they've gotten stable as a nation. And David's great desire is to build a temple to God. And at first, the prophet Nathan tells him, seems like a good idea. I think you should go ahead. But it says that God comes to him in a vision and says, you need to go tell David he's not the one. This is in Chronicles, and there are two different places. First, there's where Nathan comes to him, and we see David's reaction. Later on, I'm not going to get into that here, but later on he's telling his people, he says, there needs to be a temple, and I made preparation for it. But God said that I've drawn too much blood. I've waged a war. David was a bloody-handed man. He wasn't probably intended to be. He didn't need to be. But because he was, God said, you're not the one to build my temple. Now, for David, that's a consequence. It's a big consequence. Some of us may want to think, well, but he killed the guy and he got by with it. Not to him, he didn't. But the other thing I want to bring out, the other thing I really want to talk about is we keep talking about David being a man after God's own heart. And if you read, when we read these verses about David, he really had his heart set on building the temple. It was important to him. Everything had finally smoothed out, and now it was time to do something he thought needed to be done long ago. And Nathan comes and tells him, you can't. God says it's not yours to do. And you put yourself in that position and put most humans in that position. And they think, well, maybe he got it wrong. Are you sure, Nathan? Or you get angry. You go, haven't I served you? Haven't I done what you asked me to do? Haven't I been the king that I needed to be? And people rage against God. They get angry. How dare you? I've heard those words. So I want to read to you. I'm going to try and share the screen, and I want to read to you David's response when he hears that he doesn't get to build the temple that he so longs to build. Here we go. 1 Chronicles 17, starting at verse 16. Then King David went in, sat before the Lord, and said, "Who am I, O Lord God, and what is my house that you have brought me this far? And as if this was a small thing in your eyes, O God, you've spoken about the future of the house of your servant, and you have regarded me as a man of great distinction. O Lord God, what more can David say to you for so honoring your servant? For you know your servant, O Lord. For the sake of your servant and according to your own heart, you have accomplished this great thing and revealed all your greatness." I'll stop right there. So what's happened is Nathan has come and said, you don't get to build the temple, but one of your children will. When you're dead and gone, I'll raise up someone, one of your children, and he'll be a great king. Your line will continue, but he'll build the temple. And David's response to that, rather than becoming bitter and angry, rather than complaining about how he's done so much for God, he says, "Who am I that you would honor me? Who was I that you thought to raise me up out of the field?" Later, it talks about how he raised him up out of the field tending sheep and put him over all of his people. Who am I? And as if that wasn't enough that you did that much for me, you've actually seen fit to talk about the future, to reveal to me and to set my mind at ease. That's why David is a man after God's own heart. We have seen through the study that David continually consults God. He does so through the priests, but he consults God. And this last week, what we see, Abner comes to him with a political proposition, and David jumps on it. Up until now, he's trusted God. He's had an opportunity to kill Saul twice. And we've seen this last week that there are people who would have willingly followed him. He could have forged a kingdom, but he hasn't. But now in this situation, Abner comes to him and he jumps on the opportunity. No consultation. David's not perfect. And we'll see that that decision has consequences. And the one other thing that I'll put in because it's related is we talked a lot about all the killing. And I researched these different words for killing, for death, murder. And it's not as clear as I had hoped. Hebrew is funny that way. There's a lot of ambiguity. And a lot of times that serves a purpose. But I want you to go back and look at that whole battle. First, Abner says, let's fight. The men kill each other. None of that should have happened. Before that, though, Abner decided to put Saul's son Ishbosheth on a throne, knowing that David was supposed to become king. And so that decision leads to a decision where there's two kingdoms and the north and the south fight. And that decision leads to a situation where Asahel is pursuing Abner. We don't know exactly why, we speculate, but he's pursuing him. And then Abner has to defend himself. That could have been avoided. And then because Abner killed Asahel, Joab tricks him, waits at the gate, and kills Abner. And we'll see later that Abner, even though he's useful, isn't trustworthy, and Abner sort of gets his. That's the brokenness. That's why the law is necessary. The fact is, none of that should have happened. One bad decision, one ungodly decision leads to another. And the thing that I tried to get across that I want to be sure I get across is the law fails. The law really is, people say, well, the 10 commandments are just, you're saying they're just the 10 guidelines. In one regard, they really are. Jesus comes out later and says there's so much more. He says, if you've thought about doing these things, you're just as guilty. The commandments are a great way to let Israel live together, but they're not the full extent of God's wishes for us. And so what we see is this series of events, none of which, even though they may technically comply with the law, none of them are God's will. And when you see David make this kind of political alliance, when you see him demand a wife back politically, you see him accept a deal to become king. It really wasn't Abner's. It wasn't Abner's place to prevent David from becoming king of all Israel. And it's not his place to make David king of all Israel. And it's a bad decision. And there are consequences. And so the big thing to get across is the more I read, the more I study, the more I see that things are fantastically consistent. They are beautifully consistent. And the idea that certain people get by with things and other people don't is a myth. We almost never look at ourselves and think of all the things that we get by with, and the fact that God tolerates us is amazing. So I hope you'll see that as we keep going through the rest of this study. This is a terrible section. A lot of people lose the study when the killing begins because it looks so terrible. It's a pretty fair representation of how the world has gone. And it should be a lesson to us of how not to be. I hope that helps, and I hope we see a lot of you next Sunday.